Buddy. I would like to introduce to you Sensei Jim Bregman, who was America's first Olympic medalist in judo, which was a bronze medal in 1964. He's been a national and Pan American champion, as well as a three-time president of the USJA. Welcome, Sensei Bregman.
Thank you, Pete. Thank you very much. It's our pleasure today to have a lecture by Dr. Rob Reilly. Rob has a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in physical education. He has a doctor's degree split between physical education and regular education. He has been the editor of the American Judo magazine and the USJA coach. He is now retired and practices judo at Jason Morris's Judo Club. While employed, he was an educational researcher at MIT. He is now enjoying his retirement from the public school system in his area. And with that, I'll give you Dr. Rob Reilly. Hello, Bob.
Well,
Rob.
thank you for that, Jim. I appreciate that. And my topic today, I'm going to get right into it. So my my topic today is about teaching and learning, and the proposition that they are different. Certainly, there are teaching methods and processes in learning. Teaching methods, uh, everybody has their own teaching method. When we were in school, the teacher we liked, the teacher we disliked, they had methods that we, well, liked or disliked. And there were so many different methods, and we can always remember the teacher we learned a lot from, and why we learned that from them was interesting. It wasn't so much their method, it was the way it was presented. Well, I suppose that was their method, but it was the process of learning that they understood very deeply. My message today is that there is more to teaching than just teaching. Today we hear the idea of digital learning. It's not digital teaching anymore, it's digital learning. The concept of learning is becoming more prevalent. I'm intending today that we shift our thinking from the idea and the concept of teaching to the idea that there is a learning process that goes on. And again, the shift, and that will shift from the teacher being the focus of this to the learner being the focus of an educational event. So, physical skills. Tying our shoe certainly is a fine motor skill, and riding a bike is a gross motor skill. There, and in judo, teaching, learning, we appreciate the difference there. We appreciate the difference. And again, I'm not diminishing the idea of teaching. That's very important. And we have great teachers. And learning is where I want to take us today. So here we have a picture of, let's call it a father, and let's call it his daughter. And typically we'd say the dad is teaching his daughter to ride a bicycle. But let me suggest, and don't dismiss this right away. Wait till the end, and then you can dismiss what I'm saying. You can believe it, not believe it. There is nothing that the girl can see, can hear, can read about to learn how to ride a bicycle. There's nothing the dad can do because uh, you can't teach a kid to ride a bicycle. Oops. They can only learn. There is a great support facility given by the parent, but let me say that my purpose here today is to separate the idea that teaching is providing information, knowledge, skill to a learner. And we commingle that in judo. We call it coaching also. We combine those two terms, but they're basically the same thing. Coaching certainly is for competitive athletes. Teaching is more sports skill acquiring a sports skill. What's delivered to the person, delivering something is teaching. Learning is acquiring, storing, and retrieving it at some point. So two difference there. Teaching, delivering knowledge and information. Learning, acquiring, storing, and retrieving. So two separate functions. And I found this out on Google that exemplifies my point. Delivering and receiving. The FedEx guy is delivering, the woman is receiving. They're part of the same operation, but they are different processes. They're different processes. Okay, so back to this, teaching and learning, different processes. Teaching is delivering something to someone's brain. Learning is what happens inside that brain, which is pretty standard. Teaching, as I said, whatever your teaching method is, it's probably pretty good, unless you have 20 students one day and you come back 2 days later and there's only 3. Then you may want to ask some questions, but otherwise the teaching methods are fairly sound. Okay, so there's delivering knowledge, information to a learner. It goes into their brain. There's different segments in the brain to handle motor coordination, which is what we're concerned with as judo instructors. There's a math area, and there's logic, and several others. When Albert Einstein died, they did an autopsy and found he had an extra fold in his brain. He had an extra processing area that allowed him to do what he did. Okay, so a little more background here. There are typical learning styles, how knowledge, not how it's delivered, but how the person best receives it. And admittedly, we all have different avenues that we take in learning optimally through. The eyeball, sometimes people, you've heard, they're visual learners. There are people who are auditory learners. There are people who have to write things down and then it makes sense. And then there's the kinesthetic, which is physical. They go out and actually do it. And these learning styles are how knowledge, what's delivered, it's how that gets into your brain. And I'm going to go into talk about assessment and introduce a term later, but think of them as assessment styles. When teaching is offered, it's how someone assesses them. And in judo, well, we do it uchikomi kind of thing. We it's like riding a bike. We don't learn judo by seeing it. Certainly it enhances it, or hearing about it, writing about it. Those things may support it, but it goes back to the idea you can't teach a kid to ride a bike. So knowledge, here it comes. Teacher teaches something, it enters the brain, goes to, in our case, the motor skill area, things that organize physical skills. Some of it, as you know, no matter what you do, gets blown off. People just don't get everything. If you teach more can get into that area of the brain that handles physical skills. And again, some of it just gets blown off. They're teaching an awful lot sometimes isn't good because it all gets blown off. And I'm going to explain this in a little bit, I hope, but just to get this concept of over teaching. And this is one thing I'd like to leave us with today, the idea of knowing when you're over teaching. And in my thesis here, it involves the shift from focus on teacher to focus on the learner, which I hope will make it more evident when over teaching would happen, how you can see that. Basic premise is the teacher can't teach beyond what the learner can process. So if you've ever been in a class and the teacher is teaching something and you're processing what they just said, you're trying to figure out how that is relevant, how to store it in your brain, and the teacher keeps teaching and they're 5 minutes ahead of you. So again, don't overteach. And I'll clarify this later, I hope. Okay, again, stepping aside and going back to what happens inside the brain. There are some cognitive states to be aware of, what a learner's doing when they receive the knowledge that you're throwing out. There's assessment. You show a judo throw, you explain it, the learner is processing it. What do I do? How do I do this? And sometimes that's uchikomi, sometimes that's just seeing it and then going and doing it. Then in the dangerous area, it's overload. There's too much going on. And I hope to give you an example of how to see that when it happens in your group. And then bad state is boredom or frustration also. And the difficulty here at first is, here's a picture of a student. Here's a picture of a person. And this professor in San Francisco devised this facial action coding system. And he took pictures of people and put landmarks, their face, the furrow of their brow, their lips, their eyes, what position they were in relative to each other, and came up with someone who's frustrated, anxious, depressed. The problem we have is in the early stages, those things all look alike. They all look alike. Here's a picture of a girl in the classroom, and it would be hard to tell at first blush. She could be doing assessment. She could be overloaded and it's just checked out. She could be bored out of her mind and about to be frustrated. It's hard to tell without some other cues. If you look at the background, the other children are involved in work. They're doing something. So cognitive states, assessment is where you want to be all the time. If you get to overload, that's not a good place. It's time to go practice whatever you were showing. Okay. So moving on. How do you recognize when a student is being bored, getting frustrated, doing cognitive assessment? And more important, what do you do when someone's bored, frustrated, or they're in cognitive assessment? Cognitive assessment, you leave them alone. They're figuring it out. Frustrated and bored. Maybe it's time for uchikomi. Maybe it's time for another piece of whatever you were teaching. Okay. Another component here, managing. Think of this as managing a person's learning journey. And I'm going to talk about emotions for a moment. And I'm not talking about that adrenaline rush that a coach at a highly competitive event gives a student. I'm just talking about general emotional state that I'll go into. And know that you can manage a person's learning journey by the emotional states. And again, not that highly competitive psych up thing. Emotions have impact. They can motivate, and they provide distinctive activity. Okay. So don't even recognize this. This is overwhelming. My colleague and I at MIT, we had several National Science Foundation grants and did a lot of studies on interaction of emotions. But just know that there are positive side to emotions and negative side to emotions. The positive ones aren't always good, and the negative ones aren't always bad. It's how you manage them. It's how you recognize them and how you manage them. For example, confidence. That's a really good emotional state to have a student in, but not all the time, because confidence can lead to the other end of the scale. Well, boredom, which is down on the left. Say you have a student who's embarrassed. What do you do about it? You try to get them into the positive area, into confidence, into fascinated, somewhere else. And student is in the left, the negative side, encouragement. But again, sometimes being in the right-hand side is not always really good for all the time. Sometimes you have to challenge people and they'll end up in the left-hand sector of the emotional axis. It's important not to get too far into the left-hand side. It's important not to get too far into the right-hand side. Puzzlement. If someone is confident, throw out something that will puzzle them. Create a situation that they would have to solve. So point here is managing the emotional state and recognizing it. Just know that there are positive emotions and negative. And if you're focused on the student, I think those become much more apparent. Okay. So learning, acquiring, retrieving, storing, whatever it is that's being taught. That's what we're talking about. Whoops. Here we go. But we're really talking about storing, retrieving muscle memory. We're talking about muscle memory. Now we're getting into the judo part of this learning business. This isn't typical learning. Judo, not typical learning. It's not facts or dates or how to solve a math problem. It's muscle memory, which is a different process in learning. Muscle memory goes into the brain the same way any other part of learning goes in. Generally, if you're learning math facts, how to solve a problem, that stays up in your brain, as does muscle memory. But muscle memory triggers muscles. It triggers muscles in certain sequences. It triggers them at certain times, and that's called proprioception. That's what you're trying to do, and overloading that is going to interrupt this process, which is much more complex than math. It's much more complex than learning geography or biology. Interrupting this process from the brain to the various muscles is important to maintain and not overload. Okay, so I've thrown out quite a few things that I think are critical, but the thing we mostly do is teaching method. Let's take whole part whole, which is really simple. Almost everybody does that. We show the whole throw, then we break it down into parts in either calling the group back or stopping class and showing a different part and adding them together. Okay, so that's usually done in two ways. Usually call the class over and they sit down and you show them something, or they stay in place, and as you step through it, they do that also. Generally, the floor is open to you to ask questions or to ask if students have certain questions about what you just did. You practice one part at a time, and then you adopt one of these two features. The magic skill here is the size of the part. How much do you show them, and how do you know when the end of the part is? How do you know when you've done too much in a part? Okay, coming to that. The configuration is also important because sometimes people need to see it. Then the bottom figure here, where the students are together kneeling, that's appropriate. Sometimes melding those together is how to deliver a part. So not getting to overload. How do you do that? You know, helpful tactics. Uchikomi, what's been taught when you think that the class has reached the learning point where there's too much. And we'll get into a tip on how to recognize that. The attitude of the judoka, I've left some thoughts here to just let you read. These are some things you could do if students are becoming disengaged. Try something that's not judo. Try something that's not the skill. Undrill. Okay. Another aspect here. Feedback, two kinds. One is from the teacher and one's from the learner. And I think this is a take home. Feedback from the teacher. Let me say this. Feedback is not positive or negative. Feedback's not positive or negative. It's just accurate. It improves the skill, and that's the theory. How you deliver it, how the teacher delivers it, makes it positive or negative, but it shouldn't be. It should be helpful. It should be accurate. Okay. Other part of feedback from the learner. While you're sitting doing, for example, the whole part hold, in this example, watching the students, people squirming or shifting body positions a lot. And certainly there'll be students who do that routinely because they can't sit still for 2 seconds. But if you identify some good learners, and if they start shifting or squirming, then you know you may have gotten to the point where you've taught too much. Go to Uchikomi. If students are gazing around, same thing. They're going off task. They're not able to assess. They're not able to process. They're not processing what you've said, or they've reached a point where they just can't process anymore. And that should be a message to the instructor. Okay. So my point was, the canary in the coal mine theory is that some children just have very short attention spans and maybe having a bad day, but identifying a few students who generally stay on task and are very motivated, when they start shifting or squirming, when you're giving a part, when you're teaching something, that's a message where it's probably time for Uchikomi. Okay, enough with that. While I was doing this, I had some pieces that I also wanted to offer, as well as what I was doing, and they're very important. The role of the sensei, the role of the teacher has changed. This isn't the way things happened in 1960 when I was 20 something years old. They're very different. The parents look to the sensei for problem solving. They look for character development. The better clubs do these things. The better clubs, the instructor does these things and is focused on the learner, which my original point was, focus on the learner, even when you're teaching. The parents look for health and exercise for the children. They look in a large degree for personal development, because school more and more today, and I was a lifelong educator, schools can't be what they used to be when we were younger. There's time on learning. There is such a demand for learning that personal development kind of falls by the wayside. And a very other important issue is mental health issues. Mental health issues. Kids today come in and have so much on their mind. I remember seeing a study 5 or 6 years ago that kids in the 60s can be characterized as worrying about getting caught putting gum on the seat of their school desk. Today, they're worried about all sort of other things, and that can divert them. And the sensei's job seems to be inclusive of handling those things, what I mentioned on the previous screen. And one other very serious thing is the student, and I have in the last 10 years have run into, unfortunately, two students, not of mine, but that I know, who at the end of the day, they went home and took their life. Uh, it's unfortunate, but you don't have to be a real deep expert to see a change in a student if, as I said, you shift focus from teaching the teacher to learning, shift focus to the learner. Okay, another throw in here for personal improvement, experience. I've been around, and every once in a while I run into somebody that will say, well, I've been a sensei for 23 years. I certainly know what I'm doing. Okay, uh, it's important experience, but in my estimate, how important is it? And I've made up this graph. I think in the first 2 or 3 years of doing anything, first 4 or 5 years, you gain experience and it expands exponentially. But after that, I'm not sure how much experience you gain by simply doing the same thing over and over again. I remember years ago, I was a young child and I went every day to a golf course and helped the golf pro give lessons. And he'd give me a lesson after he was done. I'd go out and pick up the golf balls and we'd go from there. And he would constantly say, the worst thing in the world are driving ranges. People go and they practice bad habits. They think that they get experience swinging a golf club by going to a driving range. That isn't where it happens. It happens in this sort of situation by coming and hearing other theories, other thoughts, by having other instructors come in and evaluate you. Okay, here I almost wrote a book once, but the more I thought about it, the more there wouldn't be anything inside it. The cover would be students don't learn from teachers they don't like. And that'd be it. That would be it. Somehow students learn best from teachers they bond with and teachers they respect. However that works out, that's critically important. And it may go back to the slide you're talking about, knowing that the child, the changing role of the judo instructor. Okay, one other thing, changing the subject. I would go into dojos a lot, and there was this concept of perimeter coach. The teacher would do the whole thing very nicely, but then would go stand on the edge of the mat. They'd stand on the perimeter of the mat area, and nothing else would happen. They'd just stay there, call its students back, and do whole. But there'd never be any personal contact. Okay, here's a picture. This is a really good, and I'm not saying you need to kneel down and get in the person's eye level, but this is a positive. Here's another one. This seems to be a negative, right? Person has a loudspeaker, the kids are all lined up. Seems more like boot camp in the Marine Corps than a fun adventure with a coach doing a skill that you really like. Here's something that I would recommend as a takeaway, and everybody can do it. Videotape yourself teaching and review it later. Watch how you teach. And nags and nasties. That means when you give feedback to someone, is it naggy? Is it nasty? Or is it information designed to help them get better? And how much monitoring do you do? How much time do you stand and you're just watching, which may be okay, but large amounts of standing just watching, not so good. And see what the learners are doing. watch what you do in regard to the learner. Are you picking up what the learners are doing? Can you see learners who are having trouble and you go over? And in closing, my message again was there's more to teaching than teaching. There is the process of learning. And that means shifting your focus from teaching as a concept to also include the process of learning. And then shifting from you, the teacher, to the students as individuals. And remember, here's my lead-in theory. Yeah, you can't teach a kid to ride a bike. They can only learn. And you're there to help them do that. And again, teaching is delivering. Learning is when they receive it, how it's stored, not to overload it, how to recognize when it's being overloaded. Whole part whole again. I can go through this. We pretty familiar with that. And again, the magic skill is the size of the part and the configuration. Think about which one of these you use, or if you use both of them, just think about when one would be better than the other, when they'd be good in concert with each other. And feedback is not positive or negative. It's simply accurate. It's simply accurate. And one thing, as we end this, I found this presentation once, the 10 definitions of learning, and there were lots of them. And the point was, as we left, what's your definition of learning? You're the teacher, but what do you see as learning? What's your goal in a learning outcome? And it doesn't have to be really specific, but it shifts your thought from being the teacher to being the learner, shifts the thought to the learning process. Okay, so any questions? Any questions? You have, and
Hey, Rob, this is a great talk. Are you going to send this out, the PowerPoint?
Yes, the power, two things. I'm going to send this out. I will put it on YouTube and announce it the same way you found out about this in the first place. It will be on the Jim Bregman update list of that we have, that documents out. That'll be listed. And the announcement for this had the link to this PowerPoint presentation. But wait till tomorrow, because I changed it as much as like 10 minutes ago. So this version of the PowerPoint will be online shortly, and the
Great.
link will be in the announcement.
I'm sorry I didn't invite Hayward to be on this. He would have loved this talk.
Oh, thanks.
Hayward and I go back and forth, and we talk about Kahneman and fast and slow thinking, Cabano and lateral thinking, and this whole learning and teaching. It seems like it's part of the same sequence.
Yeah, and since I retired, which was about 10 years ago, the shift has changed, as I said in the beginning, from teaching. We're going to teach us. It's digital learning. The word learning is more prevalent in education, which has shifted from the learner, which has shifted from the teacher to the learner, which is terrific. And it brings all sorts of things in play. I was at Ohio State University, and Delbert Obertorfer was a professor. And the one thing I remember from his book was, he said, people exist at a baseboard level, but have a ceiling potential. And that involves thinking. That involves the teacher not just teaching, but opening someone's mind.
I got a lot of other comments, but I don't want to be the only one talking. So I'll leave it for Pete or Jim or Mal.
Anything else? Anyone else?
Anything else?
You know, I don't even have too many questions to ask. I'm just really thankful that I'm here and listening to all this, because this is so great that I was connected to this talk. just kind of for where I'm at, I haven't really had to teach too many people. I'm at the point where I moved away from my hometown, and I moved out to a small town in Western Colorado, and there's absolutely no judo. So I'm working really hard for myself to kind of get something started, and actually taking hold and taking grasp of that, and working with children and working with people. It's going to be a big challenge for me. It's going to be something I haven't had to do so much. So just to hear some of the knowledge that you have to say is so crucial. I'm so glad that I made it to this webinar. So I just want to thank you guys.
Thank you.
Are you near Colorado's? What's the university out in Western Colorado?
Oh
Is it
man,
Colorado State?
I'm not even sure. I'm not even sure, Mr. Reilly.
Okay. One of my former high school students, actually, Novoisha Yakshik, is a professor at a university in Western Colorado. He's a Sandan. And if you, I don't know how, well, if you connect, if you can send me your email address, I'll connect you with Novoisha.
That would be excellent. I'll just send you I'll send you a message right now with my email. So
Okay.
yeah, that'd be great. I'm basically connecting with a Sandan back from Sioux Falls, South Dakota, who's kind of helping me get things in line and do that. And this club is still really, really fresh. I just found somebody else who's doing judo out in Western Colorado, who has a brown belt, and we're just starting from right there. I'm waiting for more mats to come, so the amount of space that we have to train right now is ridiculously small. It's not even realistic, but I have a set of mats coming, so I can kind of grow those things.
Well, that's great. Just it will grow. It will grow. Just plant the seed and it will grow. It sounds esoteric.
That's how I feel about it. Yeah.
Hey, Miles, anything I can do to help? I mean, we have this program called the Mini Dojo program out here, and you're like the consummate mini dojo teacher. And we have a lot of ideas and thoughts on how to promote it, how to grow it. And I just sent you a Facebook friend request, so certainly avail yourself to me.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Golds. Yeah.
That would be a great connection. Anything else?
I had a couple other comments if you want to hear them.
Yeah, always, Gary.
Do you know David Matsumoto?
I don't personally.
He had a big judo club, and his daughter was an Olympian, and he's a psychologist. He's kind of dropped out of the mainstream of judo, but he has a company called Humming Tell. What they do is they analyze facial expressions. In fact, if you go on LinkedIn, he'll put up articles on how you can just read people's expressions, especially during the pandemic. He said it's a challenge because everyone's wearing a face mask. But when you were talking about reading your students for their feedback towards you, it made me think of him. And you would really enjoy seeing some of the stuff he's worked on.
Well, we had that challenge also with where the computer would read a face and have to react. But there was also body language that I didn't even touch upon that is helpful now that there's the COVID thing and the mask. But the facial action coding system, that was challenging to develop a computer that would recognize what I said, the landmarks on the face, and then interpret it.
You and David should connect. You guys would have a lot to talk about, I bet.
Yeah, I'm sure.
The other two thoughts I had was when you said about feedback is not good or bad. I really like that. And I kind of related it to the concept of Mushin, just here and now, mindfulness, and this is what I tell my students, like, don't go to a tournament, worry about winning or losing. And I'm not going to tell you this crap about it's how you play the game. It's the fact that you're playing the game. That's what counts, that you get out there, you enter the arena.
Yeah, feedback is supposed to be helpful. You're there to be a mentor, to be a guide, to be nurturing, not to slap somebody down when they do something wrong. Athletic coaches at the highest level can be a lot more negative, and that's taken well. But at the other end of the spectrum, I don't think that's a really good idea. And I know you're the same way, Gary.
The other thought I had, and it's going to complement to Kano, is randori. Because randori being free practice, when people are showing they're bored and they're ready to move on, that's probably the time to start the randori. But randori the way Sid Kelly describes it, not the way we traditionally do randori, which people get banged up and hurt. You know, shift it up, have good guy, bad guy randori, easy, but you know, let them go out, let them experiment, let them have the free practice. I think Kano, who was probably one of the best educators, really understood these concepts very, very well.
Okay, thank you. And well, we are at the end of our time, and let me leave you with this from Socrates. Socrates said, "I can't teach anybody anything. I can only make them think," which goes along with what I've been talking about. It's activating their brain, and even back when Socrates was on top of his game. Okay,
Mr. Reilly,
yeah.
I sent you a message. I just
Much, Rob, for a very informative lecture, and I think you've made a lot of very salient points. And we look forward to our next Zoom session, and Dr. Rob Reilly and Pete Mantell will coordinate it, and we'll learn more about how to do effective things in the judo community. So thank you all very much for your attention.